Excellent. Okay, so yes, so by day, I actually do really basic neuroscience. I teach mice computer games and figure out how cognition works in a more natural setting when you do everything at once and you have a lot of different motivations going on and how that can be encoded. And by night, I'm a breathwork coach. And so these dual interests kind of started converging in the last few years when I started looking into the mechanisms, the neuronal mechanisms of breathwork. And I can already tell you one of the sentences I'm going to use most during this whole presentation is, we need more data. We don't know about this yet. But from what we have gathered so far, I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about what we think happens when you do breathwork. And just like by a little sort of raise of hands or something, how many of you have done breathwork before? Okay, so there's quite a few, and obviously not everyone. So that's really nice. So for the ones who haven't experienced it themselves, I thought I would start by giving you a little flavor of the kinds of experiences that can happen. Obviously, they're always different. So this is from a client of mine. I tried to transcribe approximately what they said. And what they told about from their breathwork experience was, I saw a line of my ancestors stretching out before me, and the qualities that they had passed on, like talents, experiences, insights, burdens. I also saw where the line was broken by trauma. And I realized that in healing myself, I was also healing my ancestors, and that I need that connection to act in this world. I felt like I was sending compassion throughout the ancestral line and also to myself as its newest link, and energy started flowing back towards me from my elders, right? So that's one description of one particular experience. But since you guys are into the science of psychedelics also, some of this may sound quite familiar to you. And the qualities that I especially want to point out is that what you're hearing here is, first of all, a visceral embodied experience. So this person is not just thinking about the ancestors, they're seeing them, they're feeling like they send energy. So there's a lot of stuff actually happening in the body. Then what I would call visions. So I try not to call this hallucinations, because typically people don't think that what they're seeing or hearing is real or is in the room in a physical way. It's more like they're processing information in a non-verbal, more perceptive kind of way. Then you see that there's emotions in there, holistic insights that have the feeling of truth, of a deeper truth, even when you go back into a different state. So it's not like with dreams where something can feel really true and then you wake up and go like, it was just a dream. It's something that feels like truth when you go back into your normal states of consciousness. And a lot of the time, there's also really lasting change post-experience. So all of that obviously sounds a lot like a psychedelic experience. So the really big question is, how can this happen just by changing the rhythm of your breath? So today, the three questions I want to look at is basically, what is breath work? Then how does it work? And finally, there's going to be a little bit of philosophizing on what connects different altered states of consciousness that you enter in different ways. All right. So what is breath work? Just to give you a really brief history of what I call circular breathwork, so breathwork where you connect the breath. We'll talk about it a little bit more in a second. Basically, circular breathwork has been kind of invented and reinvented throughout history. And I would say there have been three really obvious waves of that. So the first one is sort of the ancients. So like thousands of years ago, there are traditions like Tumo that comes from Tibet, parts of the pranayama from India. There are Native American breathing practices. And for example, also things like ceremonial didgeridoo, which actually involves circular breathing because you keep making tones, right? So you basically have to breathe while you're making the music also. So it's also a circular breath. Then the next big wave of basically reinventing the circular breathwork wheel were the hippies, so to speak. I'm counting Wilhelm Reich here, which is not quite fair because he was actually contemporary of Freud. And very interestingly, he said, well, you know, it's all great just like talking about stuff, right? Like all the stuff that Freud was saying, but trauma and other things are in the body. Right? So what do we do about the body? So actually for that kind of time, I think it's really amazing that he had this kind of perspective. because obviously now with more research, we find that this is very true, that a lot of things are stored in different autonomic nervous system, physical kind of systems. Then there was Leonard Orr and Stan and Christina Groff. They're kind of the big names that are associated with the second Renaissance. Leonard Orr invented rebirthing. Stan and Christina Groff are associated with holotropic breathwork. And those people actually all came from the perspective of psychedelics are going to be made illegal soon. What can we do to reach altered states of consciousness without having to take psychedelics? Right, so that was kind of the second big reinvention of circular breathwork. And now we're sort of in the third wave of that, which is, I would call them the optimizers or the biohackers, right? So these are all people that just want their body and their mind and their psyche to work better and to relate better to their environment, right? So part of that is, for example, the Wim Hof method, coherent breathwork, transformational breathwork, and there's a lot of different sort of slightly different practices and traditions that come from that, especially from transformational breathwork. Okay, so these are kind of the different ways in which circular breathwork has been looked at and invented and practiced. So what exactly is it? So I'm going to talk about sort of the really basic parts of breathwork. So all these different traditions obviously have different kind of flavors and slightly different ways of doing things, but sort of the common denominator is that you take a long, deep in-breath into your belly, right? Then you take a fast, relaxed out breath, kind of like when you're sighing. And very importantly, you don't pause your breathing. So a lot of the time, especially when we're stressed or we're focused on other things, we make long pauses in breathing. There's actually this one paper that I found just, mind-blowing actually, which is called email apnea. So that's this thing when you open an email and it's very important and you're stressed about it, you may not breathe for a minute or two and you don't even notice, right? So a lot of the time when we're not very conscious of our body, when we're focused on other things, we're like doing stuff, we are constantly pausing our breathing, right? So in circular breath work, that's why I would call it circular, you want to really connect that, right? So together, what that sounds like is about this. So it's actually quite simple. You just keep doing that for anywhere from like 20 minutes to 3 or 4 hours, whatever your personal preference is. And that's really all it is. Typically, you're lying down. Some people also do it sitting up, but that can be quite hard, I find. And very often, you either do this in a community setting, so in a breathing circle, or with a facilitator or sitter. Okay, so what happens when you do this breath? Well, first, as you go into the process, you'll probably have some little physical symptoms, like, for example, you might feel pins and needles, like when your leg falls asleep, a little bit like that, a bit of dizziness. You may also find that your muscles start cramping a little bit. That's not dangerous or anything. That's just what happens when your O2 CO2 balance changes a little bit, and then the muscles kind of cramp up a little bit. That can also happen. Then as you go more into the breathing, as you keep breathing, your sensory perception may change. You may feel things more strongly, like colors or tones. Your perception may also change. You may start seeing things differently. Physical actions may happen. So your body may want to move, for example, or you may want to make sounds, and that may feel like your body is just doing it without you deciding to do it. Then you may lose your sense of time. Memories or emotions may surface. You may have eureka moments where kind of different bits of, things that you knew already kind of go together into like the big picture. And you're like, this is the thing that this is about. And you, as I said before, you may have visions, which is not the same as hallucinations, but it's definitely processing things in a sensory way. Okay, and so now this sounds pretty extreme, right? It sounds like there's a lot going on that's definitely not sort of normal consciousness. And, it could be that this is kind of like, people that are like, some people are more easily hypnotized than others, right? And maybe this is something that happens for a few people and not for others, but this is actually not the case. When you look at this, for example, this is a questionnaire of what kinds of experiences people had during breathwork. And you see that about 80% experience surfacing emotions, 50% body sensations, 60, 70% found that their sense of perception changed, and about 30% had visions, right? So that's quite a lot of people. It's a pretty common thing. Here's another way of looking at this by Tiziano Canello in a study that we're just writing up now. So he actually made the very cool choice of looking at a questionnaire that's meant to measure hypnotic states. And give this to people right after breathwork. And what you see here, so this is the normal baseline, and this is the breathwork questionnaire. And what you see here is the biggest difference are in altered states of consciousness, meaning, body sensations, time distortion, inward attention, and positive emotion. So again, the kinds of things that came up before already also, and it's very clearly different from baseline consciousness. So this is a very common effect of breathwork. So now the question comes, how does this work? How do all these strange changes in consciousness happen from your breathing? Well, the very short answer is nobody really knows, but we have some nice clues that we can put together. And the first step is reasonably well established. The first step is just that when you breathe in this way, you are causing physiological changes. The most obvious one being that your O2 levels go all the way up to 100% saturation, your CO2 levels go down, and that causes your blood pH to become more alkaline, so less acidic, and that's called respiratory alkalosis, and that in turn constricts your blood vessels. It also makes your heart rate go up and your cortisol go up, right? So this is quite well established. Here's, for example, a nice paper that you can also look into more. This is based on the Wim Hof method. The Wim Hof method does circular breathing, but intermittently also breath holds. So it's not exactly the same thing, but Wim Hof is one of the few people who has really pushed for this to be looked at scientifically also, which is why this is some of the best data we have, right? So we're going to sometimes lean on that, even though it's not exactly the same thing. So look at the red things now. This is where people are breathing intensely, right? So O2 goes all the way to 100%, and heart rate also goes up, but every time that you do this, it goes up a little bit less, right? So kind of the system starts adapting to this, but definitely heart rate goes up at first. So together with the Mind Foundation, I'm also involved in a study right now where we're looking into this more. And so what we're doing is we're giving people a breathwork session. And while they're doing that, we first of all put a fitness armband on them to look at heart rate and things like that. But we're also every 15 to 20 minutes letting them breathe into this little medical tube that gives you the CO2 saturation. And at the same time, we're asking them to give us a little hand sign of how deep their experience is at this moment. So we're doing this with experienced breathers because otherwise this would be super, super annoying because obviously it takes you out of the process a little bit. But so basically they do a 1 if they feel completely normal, a 5 if they're completely gone, or if they can't even raise their hand, then we also count it as a 5. And what we found in that study, so this is not yet published, but it's really fun, is that, so first of all, CO2 saturation is doing exactly what we think it should do. So in red, you see the active breathers. In gray, you see the people who are just lying there and breathing normally. In black, you see the sitters, so the ones that are basically looking at other people's processes. And you see that here, the active breathers, as the session goes on, right, time point 1 is just at the start of the session, time point 6 is at the end of the session, CO2 saturation goes down to about 15%. And at the same time, the depth of the experience goes up. So remember, 1 is kind of like normal, everyday life consciousness, and 5 is like completely somewhere else. So that's nice that this kind of fits, but we can obviously look at this more interestingly. This is, wait a second, this, okay, cool. And this is kind of when you plot those against each other, there's something really interesting happening here. So this is the CO2 saturation, and this is the depth of the experience, right? And so if you look at the time point, so blue is early, yellow is late, you see that people go through this really nice trajectory of like first CO2 saturation goes down, that gets the depth of experience to go up, and then as CO2 saturation goes back to normal, the experience still lingers on a little bit, right? And you see that there's a nice trajectory for the real, like active breathers. Then there's a little trajectories for the people who just lie there and are not supposed to do anything because they're probably kind of being taken along in the process a little bit, and an even smaller one in the sitters. So And now if you plot this again, so mean CO2 saturation and mean experience depth against each other, what you see here is that the lower quadrant is not at all populated. And what this means is that when your CO2 saturation goes down to a certain extent, it's almost impossible not to have an altered state of consciousness. Now, this is in experienced breathers. So in beginners, this might look different, but it seems to be like a real cutoff where if you go below a certain CO2 saturation, basically your brain will start doing interesting things, right? So this connection seems to be now pretty clear, right? So there's something happening here with the CO2 saturation that makes altered states of consciousness get triggered, basically. But how, right? What is the step from here to here? Well, we have some ideas. The first thing is that cortical blood flow goes down when your blood pH becomes more alkaline, right? So that's, for example, something that you can see here. So here is blood CO2, right? And as you will remember, with breathwork, you are here at around 10 to 20% CO2 saturation, and you see that the blood flow goes way down compared to normal blood flow, right? So that's the first thing. Cortical blood flow goes all the way down. And one of the things this may do, because it also doesn't affect all brain areas equally, it especially affects, for example, frontal cortical areas. This might, and so here, gray arrows mean I'm speculating, but one of the things that might happen here is that this lowers conscious control, right? Because if especially sort of the frontal, prefrontal cortical areas just don't get a lot of blood, then, for example, that little mediating voice that says, hey, it's really weird to scream in front of other people, might get a little bit more silent, right? So that's one of the things that's probably happening. But it doesn't explain everything. For example, why are memories resurfacing during breath work? That's not really explained by less cortical flow. Well, another aspect of this is that when blood pH changes, cortical pH also changes. And we know that this has an effect on neuronal activity. So here, for example, and this is a big step, this is in brain slices from rats. But what you see is that when you put CO2 in this, the neuronal waves, I don't know if this is really obvious to people who don't look at this all the time, but these are actually quite a bit more predictable than these, right? These have sort of different sizes and slightly different length, and these are kind of more stereotyped, right? So when cortical pH becomes more alkaline, basically this is the summary, you see that the cortical waves always have kind of exactly the same duration and the same height. And for example, the hippocampus quite likes that for both encoding and decoding memories, right? So that's another thing that might be happening, is that cortical oscillations become a little bit more stereotyped, and the hippocampus might therefore have an easier time retrieving and encoding memories. Again, that's speculation, but it might be one of the aspects. But again, that also doesn't explain everything, right? Where do the visions come from, or the surfacing emotions? That's probably not cortical pH, especially given the fact that different people experience really different things, whereas cortical pH probably is sort of the same for everyone who does this breath work, right? And so there's one study that looked into this a little bit. It's the only studies that I have found that managed to do EEG recordings in breathwork. That's very, very hard to do, because obviously people move all the time and are also using their jaw muscles, for example, a lot, their facial muscles, which means that you have crazy artifacts, right? So for some reason, these people managed to get like a few minutes kind of like bits without artifacts over time, and just basically analyze the oscillation frequencies that they saw. And so, for example, here they grouped this by people who reported having visions and people who reported not having visions. And what you see here, so black is always stronger, right, is that the people who had visions mainly lacked here this strong starting point of slow frequency oscillations, right? So the slow wave stuff that you see here in the people with no visions is gone in the people that reported visions. So clearly there's also some very different, like unique brain patterns going on for people who experience different things. And so the question is, where does this come from? Clearly not from cortical pH or from cortical blood flow, because those are way more unified. And so there's some kind of magical ingredient, and we do not know what it is, but one theory is that this has to do with the serotonin system, potentially with DMT. Now, this is completely not proven at all. It's just a really fun theory. It has some merits, but it's absolutely not proven. And the reason why this is a theory is, first of all, because people who have experienced breathwork and DMT-based psychedelics, like, for example, ayahuasca, say that it feels quite similar. But of course, that doesn't mean that it's the same thing. A lot of things can feel the same, even if they come from completely different mechanisms. But another reason is the study by Dean et al., which is quite an unfriendly study. So what they did here is that they experimented with rats. And in one case, they just decapitated the rats right away and looked at all the neurotransmitters that they could find in the brains. And in the other case, they first gave the rats a heart attack and then decapitated them and looked at all the neurotransmitters they could find in their brain. And what you see is that in the rats that had a heart attack first, so had a while to die, basically, you see a lot more DMT. And not only is it more, it's also approximately the same concentration that you would assume from an active neurotransmitter, like, for example, serotonin. So it's the kind of concentration that could actually do something in the brain. Now, just because this is like a persistent theory that this has to do with the pineal gland, right, with the third eye, this is not the case. So these were rats that had the pineal gland removed before surgically, and you see the same thing. So one interpretation of these results is that when the body is under extreme stress, under near death, basically overwhelming stress, it starts releasing endogenous DMT. Now, obviously, this is a big step from dying rats to breathworking humans. But actually, one of the reasons why this might apply is because you have all these weird things happening to your body that your brain may not know how to interpret, right? So normally, when your cortical pH suddenly changes and your heart rate goes up and your cortisol goes up, something is very, very wrong with your body. So it might be that it's just enough of a, strange, my body is doing some really weird stuff signal to release this endogenous DMT. So obviously, this is going to need a lot more studies to see if that's true, but that would be really fun if that's true, because that might explain some of the patterns that we see, for example, in the EEG study that I just showed you, because we have some studies now that look at what DMT does in the brain. And one of the things it does is that it really changes the distribution of oscillatory powers, right? So, for example, alpha frequency oscillations go down all the way, whereas delta and theta and low gamma go up. And more importantly, complexity goes up all over the brain very, very strongly. And complexity really just means unpredictability, right? So all over the brain, the patterns of activity become less predictable, basically more interesting, more varied. And so you can sort of see how this fits really well what we saw with the EEG study, that basically different people who are experiencing different things also have very different brain patterns and so on. So if DMT was released endogenously through breathwork, then all of these effects would apply as well. Okay, so as a quick summary, what happens potentially during circular breathing? Why are we evoking these altered states of consciousness? 3 of the big candidate mechanisms that might do this is that you restrict cortical blood flow, you change cortical pH and thereby the rhythm of neural activity, and you might also trigger the serotonin system potentially via DMT. Right. Do we have any questions so far? No, not that I can see. Oh, is this a new thing? No, this is old. Okay, cool. Then we will come to the long-term effects. So what does this do over time? Well, it seems to do a lot of good things. I will say all the studies on sort of the clinical effects of breathwork so far have been on small groups of people, not always with like the perfect control groups either, but they're all very promising. So what breathwork seems to be useful for is trauma and grief processing. It seems to decrease death anxiety and anxiety in general, PTSD, addiction, depression, and stress. And it seems to increase well-being, self-awareness, life satisfaction, and self-expression, and also increase heart rate variability, which is kind of a nice, useful catch-all measure of general physiological and emotional well-being. So that's a lot of good stuff. And also you can see again that there's quite some overlap with the benefits of psychedelics that are typically talked about. And these are some examples. So this is from a study by Martin Uthaug. Actually, by now this has come out, so it's not under review anymore. So here you can see that even at I think this was a 4-week follow-up or a 6-week follow-up, satisfaction with life has increased for people who took part in a breathwork session, and stress has decreased. This is another measure from Tiziano studies that's right now in preparation. And you see that afterwards, so this is, I think, 1 day after, heart rate variability is up in pretty much all participants. And this seems to be, at least to some extent, actually directly related to what people experienced or how deeply they experienced things. So this is something, this is again from our MIND study, Mind Foundation study. So here we looked at what the correlation was between the depth of experience that we measured during, and then the long-term positive changes that we saw 1 week after and 3 months after. So these are just 3 example ones. This is about anxiety, well-being, and depression. So anxiety and depression go down, well-being goes up. And the correlation you can see is pretty high at 1 week post, but not at all at 3 month post, which probably makes sense because so we still have effects 3 months later. They're just not related to the depth of the experience, right? Which probably makes sense because in 3 months, probably so many other life events can happen that the specific depth of this experience is maybe not the most important thing anymore. Okay, so how do these long-term effects come about? Well, there's really 2 big and I think very complementary ways of looking at this, at least from what I have seen. Again, this has to be looked at much more sort of systematically, but I would say the 2 big ones are embodiment and what Ari Brower and Robin Carhart-Harris called pivotal mental states. And from what I've heard, you guys already got to talk about that. So I'm only going to do a little short thing on this, but I love that theory and I think it makes a lot of things very, very clear. So let's talk about embodiment first. So the point here is that both mental resources and also traumata and stress are experienced in an embodied way, right? If you feel confident or competent or joyful, you feel it in your body, right? You feel it in how your face works and wanting to move, there's stuff happening in your body. Same thing for traumata, right? If you get triggered or you experience something really stressful, the first thing that you will experience is probably not that you think, this is stressful for me. The first thing that you will experience is your heart rate goes up, you can't breathe, your hands get sweaty, right? So it's all embodied stuff, right? So the thing is then, if we want to address these things, if we want to, free up mental resources and maybe address traumata, we also should do this in an embodied way, right? And what this really means is through the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system tracks a lot of your vital functions, and usually it doesn't need any conscious control. That's why it's called autonomic, because it doesn't really rely on your brain to, control things, right? So that's things like, for example, saliva and how your stomach works and your gut and your heart rate and all those kinds of things, temperature controlled, all that kind of stuff that you don't really have to think about normally when it works well, that, just happens. Now, breath is a really funny one in this sense because it can be both under autonomic and cortical control, right? When you don't think about breathing, you're still breathing. When you're sleeping, you're still breathing. And yet you can clearly also consciously control how you breathe. So it's one of the very few functions that can be accessed by both your cortex and your autonomous nervous system pretty much equally well, right? And at the same time, it's also part of a full body feedback loop. So that means depending on how you breathe, your heart rate will change, your temperature, your serotonin levels. So it's a really powerful lever right, that can be pushed both by your autonomic nervous system and your cortex. And therefore, it's kind of a bridge between the cortex and the autonomic nervous system, and we'll get back to that. So that's why breathing can be such an interesting tool. Now, just as one kind of really salient example, imagine the relationship between some kind of stress that happens, a stressful event or a trauma, and what happens in your body. Well, one of the first things that usually happens to people is that you start breathing in a strained way, right? That's a really old reflex from, throughout the evolutionary ladder. When you look, for example, at mice and other small mammals, you see that when they get stressed, the first thing they do is they freeze up, right? So, and this reflex is still in us, right? So if you're stressed, the first thing that happens is you kind of stop breathing, or you stop breathing deeply, right? As you can imagine, that doesn't really help your emotional state, right? So if you've tried breathing like this on purpose, it's actually super stressful, even if you're not stressed, right? So there you already have a feedback loop, right? Then the next thing that happens is if you keep breathing in this strained way, this will actually cause physical symptoms, right? So your O2 saturation goes down, your CO2 goes up. That means that less serotonin gets released in your body, right? And at the same time, the stress in itself, obviously also via cortisol, for example, and other transmitters, causes physical symptoms directly, like, for example, inflammation and immunosuppression, right? So again, we have like a really ugly, vicious cycle going on here, because all those physical symptoms, obviously, again, will not help your mental state, right? So at this point, your autonomic nervous system is in a vicious cycle, right, of freezing, being stressed, therefore being physically unwell, therefore being stressed, and so on, right? So we just said that breath is the bridge between conscious and autonomic processing, and breathwork can cut a couple of these cycles, right? So the first really obvious one is it can cut the connection between stress and strained breathing, right? Because you're very consciously expanding your breath as much as you can, right? So that's pretty obvious. But interestingly, it can also directly tackle the physical symptoms that come from long-term stress, like, for example, inflammation and immunosuppression. So I'll show you some data on this. So there's a pretty serious amount of work now that shows that things like, for example, PTSD, prolonged trauma, have direct effects on the immune system, and especially on heightening inflammation via a lot of different molecular pathways that I'm not going to go into right now. But here, there's a couple of really good reviews that are worth looking at if you're interested in this. And it turns out that breathwork directly counteracts that, right? So again, this is data from the Wim Hof method. I assume that this doesn't look too different for other types of breathwork, but we don't know. So what happens when you are trained in Wim Hof breathing in this case is that your signaling pathways get a little bit different, right? So for example, when you are exposed to an immune challenge, so basically you're exposed to bacteria, right? What happens is that your epinephrine and norepinephrine goes up, but your cortisol goes down. And as a result, you have both an increased anti-inflammatory response, that's here, IL-10, and you have a decreased inflammatory response. So that's IL-6 and IL-8 and TNF-alpha. So this means that overall, your body just responds better to difficult stimuli. And you see that here, as a result of that, of all these changes with cortisol and inflammatory markers, people have a much better time when they're exposed to bacteria. So this is the symptom score after people were literally just given bacteria in their bloodstream, either people who had practiced Wim Hof breathing and people who hadn't. And you see that a couple of hours after they were given the bacteria, a lot of the people who hadn't done Wim Hof breathing showed a reasonably high symptom score, things like fever or, feeling dizzy, heart rate, all that kind of stuff. And these are the people who do Wim Hof breathing, and it's much, much smaller, right? So basically, your immune system just seems to be better at responding to challenges in a really effective way and making you feel less miserable. So this is kind of the second part where breathwork can directly break the cycle. Interestingly, the third point where breathwork can do something is the connection between stress and physical symptoms. And this is a really quite new insight and a really hopeful one, because basically what seems to be happening is that breathwork helps you to consciously interface with your autonomic nervous system in a way that wasn't believed to be possible even a few years ago. So here's a really nice example of this. So this is an experiment where people were basically packed into cooling packs all over their body. That could be either warmed up a little bit or cooled down. And here you see, so here is where nothing happens, and here is where people are cooled down, and then again nothing, and then again being cooled down. And here the blue line is the one for the control participants. And you see that, as you would expect, the body temperature at the core goes down when the cooling packs are switched on. And the same happens here for this red line. This is Wim Hof when he's not doing anything in particular, right? And he's being cooled down in pretty much the same way that everyone else is. Now, this is Wim Hof when he's doing Wim Hof breathing. And you see that the temperature is completely stable. So this means that at this point, basically, when he's doing his breathing, he seems to have a control over his temperature that people normally just don't have. Now, you could think, oh, maybe the breathing just freed up some kind of molecular pathway that keeps the body warm, right? Maybe this is like a really simple physiological thing, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Oh, by the way, I didn't want to deprive you of this. This is the fruit of Wim Hof's labor. That's him climbing the Himalaya without a t-shirt. So there's some really cool benefits to doing this practice. And that doesn't seem to be just like a simple sort of weird physiological reflex. This seems to really have to do with your cortex interfacing with your autonomic nervous system. And that was initially shown, to my knowledge, in this quite obscure study that looks at people doing Tummo breathing. So Tummo is this Tibetan practice, thousands of years old, practiced by monks that basically inspired the Wim Hof method. And what you see here is, in one case, they're just doing the breathing. So the circular breathing, essentially, like very similar to what I said before. And in this case, they're doing the breathing while also doing the typical meditation of Tummo practice, which is to imagine like yourself being really warm, like being on fire, breathing fire, that kind of thing. And what you see here is that, yes, you do warm up when you just do the circular breathing, but you warm up a lot more when you also think of, fire, right? And there's actually an even nicer thing here. So this is basically the alpha power in the recorded EEG compared to the increase in body temperature when people are starting to meditate. And you see that there's a really strong correlation. So basically, the more you go into the state of meditating on warm things, the more your body temperature increases. So this suggests to me that circular breathing is not just, for example, keeping you warm. It's actually establishing a stronger communication between what you consciously think and what your body and your autonomic nervous system are doing. And so now this is for temperature, which is cool, but you can imagine that this may also work for things that are more directly related to your mental state and your stress, like, for example, heart rate, right? Okay, so quick summary on the idea of embodiment and how breathwork can in the long term help with embodiment. So the autonomic nervous system usually shouldn't be very much in our control, but breath can act as a bridge between the cortex and the autonomic nervous system. And the more communication you get between those two parts, the more you may, first of all, feel what's happening in your body, but also be able to choose how you want to react in your autonomic nervous system. Okay, that brings us to our second theory or framework for understanding the long-term effects of breathwork, and that's pivotal mental states. So for all of you who have seen Ari's talk, this is going to be like a super, super simplified summary. But basically the idea would be that, your brain is kind of on its merry way through life, and suddenly it encounters a challenge. And it encounters a challenge that's not just like a little annoyance, it's like really overwhelming and huge. And as a result, it kicks its serotonin system into very, very high gear. And what this means is that perception becomes less filtered and learning becomes a lot stronger, and plasticity also, right? So basically, whatever is around you at that time will be perceived in a much more unfiltered way and will be stored in a much more intense way, right? So this already shows that the main point here is what is around you and in you at that time, right? So depending on what your circumstances are, you may come out of that either with, for example, PTSD or with post-traumatic growth or with something completely different, right? So I think that's really the beauty of this framework, is that it says basically, this is basically just a state where a lot of different things can happen, but what happens depends on your context, right? Now, the cool thing about this is that, this can happen to you in life through different experiences, through intense things that just happen to come your way, but you can also do this voluntarily by putting yourself in a situation where your body gets a lot of very, very intense inputs and kicks into the serotonin system. And if you use this voluntarily, you may get things out like, for example, being able to reshape your mental habits because you have stronger learning, stronger plasticity, or retrieving suppressed information because you have less filtering, or rewriting past experiences through new learning in new contexts. Okay, or in other words, rewriting your experience through self-challenge, right? So that's also what we had in the first experience that I talked to you about, remaking your ancestral line through compassion, right? That's basically rewriting your experience of the world and of your family constellation through self-challenge, in this case, through breath. And it turns out that this is not really a new insight at all. It's actually very, very old. So when you look at rituals that are happening in different cultures all around the world, you notice that this idea of changing your mind through self-challenge is a super, super common theme, right? So these are just a couple of practices that I came across that are doing this through breathing. And then there's other practices that do this through pain exposure, like, for example, tattooing, like ritual, traditional tattooing, or through hot or cold exposure, like, for example, saunas and sweat lodges and, like ice baths, all that kind of thing. Then through sensory overload, like, for example, really loud drumming, powwows, dervishes who kind of move around and, like for hours, like circle around. So all of this is basic sensory overload. And of course, also things like sleep deprivation, food deprivation. So this is a very, very common theme across a lot of cultures. And I feel like we're only basically rediscovering this way of, interfacing with your own nervous system. Okay, so let me summarize this. First of all, what do we actually know about circular breathing? We know that breathwork alters physiology, especially blood pH, heart rate, and cortisol levels, and that this affects neural activity and thereby consciousness. We also know that in the long term, this seems to benefit mental health, like, for example, anxiety, depression, and by increasing life satisfaction. What I think is happening is that breathwork is one of the many paths into a pivotal mental state through physical self-challenge. And because in the pivotal mental state, you take up whatever is in you and around you, breathwork sessions are particularly interesting because they, first of all, evoke safety, because your breath is always under your own control, right? It's not like a substance that you take. If something gets too much or too weird for you, you can always slow down your breathing. So it evokes safety. It also should evoke support and connection, because typically it's done in the presence of either facilitators or community, and embodiment, because unlike with other paths into a pivotal mental state, you are constantly breathing. So your breath is a constant connection to your autonomic nervous system. And so because of this particular setting, I think breathwork is particularly suited to evoke pivotal mental states that help you to experience body-led healing. All right, you also can be part of breathwork science. So there's some in-person studies going on in Berlin, but I'm guessing that that's going to be quite hard for you guys to take part in. But there is right now an online survey on breathwork being conducted by Malin Uthag from Imperial College. And so whenever you know that you're going to do a breathwork session, you can sign in there and fill out questionnaires before and after to kind of see what's happening. Yeah, that was a talk. And here are still some resources if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha. Amazing lecture.
Thank you.
Super interesting.